Thank you. And thank you, Oliver, for putting this together. And thank you all for showing up here. I see these faces. I want to reach out and shake your hand. It's good to see you. Um, uh, so, uh, Standing back from this, first, these are working slides from discussion here at Bocconi, and I'll probably be doing some talks around this. They're posted on my website, which you can see here. If you do a search for Ronald S. Burt, you'll find these. They'll change as things go forward, but some of the slides are fairly detailed, and I don't plan to get into the detail so much as you'll probably know these background bits. The two broad points to kick this off are first, in talking with my Bocconi colleagues, that's Sonia Opper and Ali Iorio and Beppe Soda and Marco Tortoriello, and Pierre Minucci. We were struck with how opportunistic much research is, where if someone stumbles into a data set and is there something I can do with this? We wanted to think strategically. If we had limited time to do research, where would we want to focus in order to move the wheel forward? And so a piece of this is looking over the past and looking into the future to find where one might make a difference. And here's a fun exercise. I don't know if you've done this before, but one of the things that's always grated in my craw is how popular a simple introductory essay is that Denise Rousseau coordinated. Really, this was Denise and Sim Sitkin, but I was on it and Colin Kammerer too. But this thing has gotten 18,000 citations. And so, it's high up in my list of publications. So I asked Chat GPT, actually, I'd switched to Claude. This is Claude, the AI guy. Why is this thing popular? It's just a couple pages. It has no content. It's just an introduction. It even pulled through a variety of papers in the special issue of AMR that are, for the authors, one of their most visible pieces. And as you can see, what Claude explained to me is this paper lives in a structural hole. There were a set of constituencies that were ready to talk to one another from these different groups, and they didn't have a common language, and they were suspicious of each group trying to propose a language. So Denise drew together a group of people to make language, and this thing became popular. Now, that's an illustration of there's no content to this, but it was in the right place at the right time to have an incredible traction. And it's that kind of conversation that we've been having with where can we make a difference with the work that we're doing. Sonia and I have a book that's just come out that makes me believe the current generation of work in network analysis will have its biggest bang on the concept of trust and cathartic events in history. Now, there's strong contenders. There's neuroscience, there's linguistics, but I think this is going to be the one that'll do it. And what I want to do here is try to make that case. And if you see holes in it, I'd love to know. I'll be fairly brief in the lead up because this is a history we all share. And then I'll get more detail at the back. I'm going to shoot for about 40 minutes so that we've got lots of time at the back end. So here's the broad discussion. There's this long history of research on network brokerage. I believe there have been 3 generations to it. Generations tend to happen when a data methodology shifts. And then there's a reconceptualization around that. It's been a rich history. And what I want to do is argue why I think trust and cathartic events in history are going to be the new generation. This table is something I'm going to come back to as I go from first generation, second to third to fourth. The first generation is post-war US. This is when survey research is going on. And in particular, 2 people, Bob Merton and Paul Lazarsfeld are pushing this forward. And they're pushing it forward by really episodic little bits of research. Paul, with one of his surveys in Elmira that Katz participates in, and Bob in a couple of interviews that he did. But what they come down to is people tend to be locals or cosmopolitans. Locals focus on the immediate environment, trusted contacts, they know the local. Cosmopolitans read and have contacts in distant places, mass media, radio, the various things that they'll do. These are the key works in this, the People's Choice for Lazarsfeld. This was a huge one. Personal influence separated the opinion leaders who then get information from far away and hand it off to locals. Bob, of course, making this distinction between cosmopolitans and locals. And what one ends up with through both of them, plus the Festinger, Schachter, and Back book, Katz with Lazarsfeld, Ash with his conformity experiments, are these two key features to the link between information and networks. The world exists as a bridge and cluster structure. There's clusters of people who are the local, and then there are these occasional bridging ties that go out into other worlds. The cosmopolitans man the bridges, the locals live inside. Information tends to be homogeneous inside clusters, heterogeneous across clusters. Not guaranteed to be heterogeneous, but when heterogeneity happens, it's more likely in different clusters than in the same clusters. Such that we end up with this image that I often use when I'm talking about organizations, where there are clusters of people in management who are tied together, and then these occasional bridging ties across. Second generation, a brilliant cohort of students at Harvard. And it's stunning how this wasn't the faculty. This is 3 graduate students. In particular, Milgram, Nancy Howell, and Mark Granovetter. Mark must have been a phenomenon when he was there. The broad idea is, if we're searching for information, do we go to friends who are the locals, or do we go through these weak ties into distant clusters? And what Milgram showed was that in his small world, where people in the middle of nowhere, forgive me if you live there, trying to get to Boston, those who go through distant ties are much more likely to be successful and reach a person. Nancy search for the abortionist at a time when it's illegal. Those who ask their close friends often don't find an abortionist because those people know what you know. It's the people who reach out past their immediate environment. Mark Granovetter, in his dissertation, searching for a job, those who ask their immediate friends, those people know what you know. It's when you go outside the circle. So when you're searching for information, going through weak ties, which is a bridging tie outside of the group, tends to be more productive. This then gets generalized into the forbidden triad. Now, Mark's not stupid. He says this doesn't occur all the time. But on average, it will happen when you go through a weak tie, you're more likely to get to different information. So it's a layer on top of the bridge and cluster structure. This fits into a cluster of activities that define a closure trust association. The more closed a group is, the more people are interconnected with each other, the more likely they'll trust one another. As they don't have ties in common, trust becomes less likely. Here's an illustration of the association with some data that don't matter. Some are from China, some are managers, but the horizontal axis is a count of how many mutual ties do we have. So here we have no friends in common. This is a bridging tie. 1 friend in common, 2, 3, 4, 6 or more. As there are more and more people in common, trust goes through this nonlinear increase. where those first few ties matter much more than the others, but there's this positive association. That closer trust association is generic to the 70s and 80s. In economics, it's Coase's theory of the firm from 1937, but Avner Greif really gave this some oomph when he talked about Mediterranean traders and the Phoenicians with joint sources of information. In psych, we've got balance theory, we've got the, and then we get the Festinger, Schachter, and Back book on the formation of friendships. In sociology, we have Blau's parameters of social structure. We've got Mark Granovetter's tie, of course, but then his embedding is the same theme along that. And then, of course, Coleman picks this up in his image of social capital. And then in law, there's Ellickson's work on the Shasta Valley ranchers. How do we have social order without contracts? And Lisa Bernstein's wonderful work on the Diamond Exchange, showing how that works. And then Putnam knows a good idea when he hears it. He picks up Coleman's idea, turns it into a lively career on applied conceptual work on social capital as a rhetoric. If we look at what relations tend to decay, those that are these bridge relations are much more likely to decay. These are investment bankers. The vertical axis is a death rate. So after 1 year, the death rate of bridge relations is about 92%. Now, these people live in a fruit fly kind of existence where they're frequently making ties, which makes sense. If the ties are embedded, that drops to 53%. This peaks quickly, and the surviving relations are much more likely to survive. But notice, by the time you get to the 3rd year, these are within the confidence interval of one another. It's the early death rate of bridge relations that is distinct. When we look at who do you trust, people tend to distrust when they live in a close group, because that distinguishes people who are close to me from these bridging ties that reach beyond. These are Chinese entrepreneurs playing a prisoner's dilemma game with someone they don't know. The more open the network around a person, the more likely they're going to trust that person. The more closed the network around someone, the more they're suspicious of outsiders. And so you get these high defect rates against them. All this around the idea, close the network. The reputation cost of bad behavior means that people are unlikely to hurt you within the cluster. When pain comes, it's likely to come from beyond the cluster. Are you okay so far? Ron, that makes sense? Bill? Okay.
But we had a question from the audience. Professor X here wanted to ask something.
Was that Axe?
Hi, Ron. How you doing?
How are you doing?
Good to see you. So as you know, we are working on the introduction to this book on trust and networks. And I had a question about your, very carefully phrased verbiage on the association between trust and closure. And then there's a whole slew of academic disciplines. I'm just wondering, because you started with the common language idea.
Yeah.
What kind of common understanding could you think applies in the trust closure association across all those disciplines in terms of a mechanism that relates? And this is the association, but
okay, I'm with you, Axe. And it's good to see you, by the way. I put you two that I think have been used in different contexts. One, and I would see this in social psych and some of Blau's work, is if you and I have friends in common, we have tastes in common, so that we have reason to trust one another because we understand one another, right? This would be one storyline. From economics into Coleman, into Putnam, there's more of a reputation story. That when there's a closed network, If you behave badly, everyone's likely to know about it. So you're less likely to behave badly. Therefore, I can trust you because there's this norm of you don't want to be ostracized by the group. That would also slide over to the Bernstein and to the Ellickson. So I've seen both of these play. For the moment, it's not essential because I'm not making a causal argument about it. I'm just taking for granted that there is this association, that inside the clustered network, for one reason or another, trust is much more likely. And then there's suspicion across clusters, trust within. Are you okay?
Yeah, that's okay for now.
Third generation. This one turns on gathering data on the relationships around a relationship. So in the earlier generation, they did a search algorithm. And this thing is, if I want to get to new information, what kinds of ties are going to get me there sooner? And Mark then advocates that in many occasions, weakness can be used as an indicator of bridginess. Yeah. In the 70s and 80s, work started to get done with this kind of thing. This is from the GSS. The real push here, Ed Lauman and some others had data sort of like this, but they were aggregate in the sense, do your friends tend to know one another or do they not tend to know one another? But Claude Fisher really pushed this forward when he asked these matrix kinds of questions with how closely connected are the first person and the second, the third person and the fourth, where it's individual ties, yeah? And then you could build out a network around the survey respondent. Out of that work came, in fact, weakness is a very poor indicator of bridginess. Here's strength of tie, weak ties, strong ties. Here's location and social structure, inside a cluster, beyond a cluster. More ties are within a cluster than beyond. We know more people like us than we know people different than us. More ties are weak than are strong. And if you just take expected values, there's a lot of weak ties that just link you to people who know the same thing you do. Yeah. So if you do the search and then ask, was that through a weak tie? It makes perfect sense. But if you use the weak tie as the predictor, it's likely to be a complication. What makes a relationship a bridge is the hole it spans. This then leads to the idea of structural holes, sticky information inside, the bridginess, and these network entrepreneurs. And we get this volume of research that shows the more closed the network, the lower the innovation, the achievement, the promotion, a series of things. These data come from a variety of sources. Because this has been mentioned several times, I'm just going to leave it for the moment. But in this is a complication because the ability to use those bridge relations depends on your social standing in the target audience. These are three measures of standing in an audience when people have the potential to be a network broker. This is job rank. Are you high up in the management population? This is network status. Are you cited by people who tend to be cited a lot? It's the eigenvector definition. And this is reputation. Are you known as a person who's reputable, safe to deal with? I just broke them at the average, at 50%. So half, the second, the higher half, and the lower half. For the people who have above average job rank or above average network status or above average reputation, we have that downward slope where network brokers do extremely well. If you're a reputable person, if you're a high status person, if you are the CEO, people are happy to take your idea. If you're some schmuck who nobody cares about and nobody talks to, there's just no return at all. Now, this leads to a line of argument that brokerage is fragile, that if you don't have the right credentials to be a broker, you won't be able to get away with it. Yeah, which has been sort of haunting the network brokerage literature out of that third generation. There have been some suggested solutions. So, for example, Dave Krakart has his Zimmel ties, and this goes way back where he proposed these, where if you have a bridge but you have someone in common, you can get away with the bridging solution. The Santola, and I think it's Guilbeault, it's Doug out in Berkeley, have this beautiful work on when you're looking for bridges through weakly connected environments like the internet, then a wide bridge is valuable, which they mean is this. You can see here's one path, but here's the path that's most likely to carry information because every step is reinforced. Now, David would call these Zimmel ties, but you can see what they're after. A third is institutional embedding. And Kate Stovall has just a beautiful paper on kinds of normative systems that make it safe to be a broker and safe to trust a broker. All of these make perfect sense, but they destroy the idea. Because the idea is to get information from a trusted source outside my circle of contacts. As soon as the ties that take me there are deeply embedded, it's the same group that I'm already in. It's a group that shares the institutions, the group through which we have these wide bridges, or of course, Zimmel ties are the same kind of thing. So I wanted to find, wrong word, that sounds instrumental. This was dumb luck, and I might as well give dumb luck credit. I've heard Sonia Opper make a presentation about her work with Victor Ni in China, where, and this was in the book Capitalism from Below, where she had a lot of discussion of networks, but no network data. And I thought, oh, what a shame, because it seems the effect is there, but no data were gathered. So I proposed, why don't we do a survey of those entrepreneurs? Fortunately, she had the budget for that. And I thought, just to make life interesting, let's gather name generator information on how people were connected before the survey. And so we used this event name generator, which was what you see up above is there's a start date. This is when you founded your business. There's a current date. This is when we're doing the interview. And then just to make it tractable, we broke it in half and then broke each half in half. Yeah? And then we asked them, when you first founded the firm, who was it who was particularly helpful in getting this thing founded? One name. Second, what was the most significant event that you went through? And it could be something like your first international contract. It could be I lost a supplier, and in China that was a dramatic issue because there aren't that many alternatives. Who helped you through that? There are these key events, and there are these people who help you through those events. All well and fine. It was just meant to be entertaining. But what we found was the following. When we do the usual closure trust association for ties that were gathered the usual way, who do you talk to, who's valuable, who's an advisor, we get the usual positive association. But with these event ties, trust was tremendously higher, and it had the same functional form. Now, over here, that's not too surprising. This tended to be family. It's someone that's deeply embedded with mutual ties. But these are surprising. These are strong ties where you don't have mutual contacts. Yeah? And so we're wondering, what are they? Yeah? Now, speculating over aperitivo, we thought, well, it's probably the case that this was an emotional moment. This is someone you met. This was someone who helped you out when your ass was in a sling, and turned out to be a pretty good person after that. So even though they're not part of your network, this is a special go-to tie if there's a problem. And we proposed, well, let's predict how this would go. There's probably a special category of relations based on cathartic events in your life, where you were at risk and somebody was there. Yeah? And over time, it turned out they weren't a schmuck. They were a pretty good person. That's a person to hang on to. Now, I don't know how you are in your life, but I've got maybe a dozen of these people who are just go-to people that I trust with anything, and I'd want to try to take care of them. And I'd be a little worried about asking too much of them. But we said it's probably this kind of equation where here is third parties, the number of third parties to our relationship. There is, for normal relations, a positive association. Then for what's going to turn out to be guanxi, this special category of relations, there's a level up and there's a multiplier, which decreases this sensitivity to context. Let me explain that. I'm watching Ron here. I know Ron. I don't need to have mutual friends to know and trust his work. Yeah. That would mean that trust in Ron is going to be very high, and it's going to be relatively independent of the mutual friends we have. So that when I don't know someone well, mutual friends has a tremendous effect. But when I really believe I know someone, I don't need those mutual friends. It's going to be trust based on a history with that person. So we thought, okay, that makes sense. It's sort of cute. Let's ask a new sample of people whether it's true. So this is the book, Strong Bridges. We're going to find out it's right. We're going to treat the Chinese category of guanxi relations as a kind of word. And Merton and Barber had this lovely book. They call it a niche word. In different cultures, there's different words that mean the same thing. But basically, this is my go-to person. This is someone I know I can trust, who would help me if I'm in a jam. Now, this is a complication in China because, like most such words, they have their own peculiar usage. This is Google's Ngram. In general, guanxi is felt intimacy, trust, mutual obligation. Outside China, people have been explaining the Chinese to one another with increasing volume. And they've come up with all kinds of meanings for this. And in the book, we have some time spent on the semantics of guanxi. In China, it's pretty much a negative thing. It's used by the government when personal relations have gotten in the way of state mandates. So you see high use of guanxi when the government is on an anti-crime wave. Very different uses of this. We're going to put both of these to one side and ask people, what do you mean by this? So here's going to be a little volume of text that we can then analyze for what sort of text do people use to describe this relationship when it's embedded, when it's a bridge, etc. Then, who are the people you would name as guanxi? We'll get those listed, and then we're going to lay those on top of the usual network structure to see whether we reproduce those event generators. And there's two hypotheses that are going to drive this. The first is, do we reproduce those two trust associations, which are higher trust and independence of the structural embedding? And then secondly, how important are these bridge relations to achievement? Because what we're going to end up showing is that bridges don't matter. What matter is strong bridges. Weakly connected to people outside your group matters not at all. It's these strong bridges. And you might ask yourself, think of someone who comes to you with new information, new kinds of research, but you don't respect that source. Much easier to ignore the source than to do the due diligence of checking the information. But if someone comes to you that you know is a good person and they offer something, oh, damn, are you sure? You'll do the due diligence on it because it's coming from that source. So we'll see how this comes through. We don't need this piece. This is a beautiful kind of analysis. I'm going to go fairly quickly on this because we're coming up on my 40 minutes. I don't know if you've seen this before, but the idea is to create a binary data deck where the relationships are down the rows and the columns are kinds of relations. In this case, there's 57 kinds of relations. Each one is a 1 or a 0. And then a row would be a profile of these binary. Is this embedded guanxi? Is this strongest guanxi? Is this family? Is this a distant tie? Just all possible combinations. Then do a smallest space analysis of what things are associated with what else. This space tends to be one that gets reproduced frequently, which is the first axis, and the biggest axis is positive, negative. Over here are positive ties. Over here are negative ties. The second axis, and it tends to be a much shorter axis based on variance explained. These are based on the eigenvectors. Up at the top are personal to me ties. At the bottom are positive ties, but they're not so personal. And this tends to happen whether we look at management networks or even GSS data. Point number one, this is the event ties, if you remember. This is the theoretical prediction, if you remember. This is what happens when we use the guanxi ties. And notice, not only does it reproduce this, it makes it even cleaner. We don't have this initial low dip. These are indeed strong bridges independent of structural embedding. Yeah? We then ask, these people who have these strong ties independent of structural embedding, does it matter for the achievement of their organization? This is network constraint. To what extent is your network concentrated in one source so that you don't have any brokerage opportunities? Low means you have lots of bridging ties. High means that you're living inside one cluster. If we look at all ties, we get the same thing we've got in the past, which is a strong negative association. The more you live in a closed network, the more likely you're a failure. If we only look at current ties, there's something there, but it's much weaker than this. If we exclude the guanxi ties, it's entirely gone. If we exclude everything but guanxi, it's back again. It is the ability to trust diverse people that is the key. This is much sharper in the demonstration. And I like it because you don't need to know any statistics for this. The first cut is between entrepreneurs. Over here, they live in a median or higher constraint network. It's relatively closed. Over here, they live in a relatively open network. So roughly cosmopolitan versus local. Within each, you have no bridges. You have bridges, but they're not guanxi. You have 1 or 2 guanxi bridges. In closed networks, the achievement, relative profit of your venture is all negative. It doesn't matter if you have 1 or 2 guanxi ties if you're in a closed network. Closed network people don't do well. Look at the effect for the people who are inside open networks. If there's no bridges, which means you have bridging ties, but they're weak enough that none of them would qualify as bridges, it's the worst of all possible. If you have bridges, but they're not guanxi, it's not people you trust, doesn't give you anything. One will give you lift, two or more will give you the key people who are doing well. There's some reassuring answers. What Sonia and I did was we established that. We did that in the AJS article, established that. But then the wonderful thing about a book project is you can answer alternative stories. So one, are strong bridges limited to relations associated with certain kinds of help? Maybe there was a kind of event you went through. No, they're not. And this came up, one of the things that followed the structural holes work, in particular around the GSS, was asking people about important, with whom do you discuss important issues? And people say, well, there are some people who think trivial things are important. I remember Peter Behrman had found a respondent for whom the important issue was cultivating frogs or frog farming, some sort of thing. And I remember thinking, it's not up to you to decide whether an event is important. It's up to the respondent. And if a respondent thinks frog farming is a key issue, frog farming is a key issue for that person. Yeah? In the same way here, we thought, well, so you scraped your knee. That's not an important thing. But for this one egocentric person, it could have been scraping their knee was a pretty important thing. Whatever it is, this is in the mind of the respondent. And it didn't matter what label they put on events. It mattered, did you have an event that you thought was critical in your history? Do the advantages of strong bridges provided by guanxi depend on family or other? Maybe guanxi with family is more important than guanxi with coworker. No, it didn't matter. Kind of tie washes out. What matters is this cathartic event where you had this tie formed with a person. Are strong bridges provided by guanxi particularly resilient to disruptive events? Yes. These are the ties that lived through COVID. The ties that were likely to be destroyed in COVID were bridging ties that didn't have that cathartic event as history. Are the strong bridges provided by guanxi unique to China? No. We show the same thing in a series, without the same detail, in a series of surveys of Europeans. This is a general phenomenon. So the core implications, the following. Don't worry about the diversity of your acquaintances. Worry about the diversity of close friends you trust. Trusted contacts and groups outside your own are your strong bridges. Those strong bridges endure and index your competitive advantage. Sounds silly when I read it there, but it's a wonderful message. And what it then leads to is this fourth generation, which is, it's not any bridging tie. We first went through weakness is a good indicator. It is if you're in a search mode, but if you're gathering data and then predicting to what extent is this person exposed to diverse information, then the actual absence of corroborating relations is important and structural holes come in. It turns out bridges across structural holes aren't enough. It's these trusted ties across structural holes that are the key to competitive advantage. And that then makes a thing very cognitive. This is your spin on trusting people who are different than you. And many people can't do that. So there we are. I made it in 40 minutes. I'm impressed with myself.